To slaughter a homestead pig, first you'll want to make the kill shot and then attach the back legs of the pig to something that can drag the animal over to where you will be doing the rest of the work, and then hanging it and completing the process. The dragging does not damage the meat so long as you're not speeding across the yard or dragging it over any rocks or rough terrain. If you're not familiar with where to shoot a pig and what the twitching of the muscles after the animal dies looks like, or how that works, make sure and check out a video on that so you're prepared for the movement of the animal's body even after it's dead. The well-placed shot will be to the forehead so that there is an instant lack of life and an instant lack of feeling to the animal throughout the rest of the process. As quickly as you're able after shooting the animal, you'll want to slit the throat so that the blood inside of the animal can begin to drain out. Be careful to cut into the main artery there so that that can drain. That will continue to drain through the process and then continue when the animal is hung. We use logs on either side to hold against the sides of the animal so that it stays on its back with its belly straight up in the air. Then using sharp knives to begin the skinning process. You can start on the legs or you can start at the belly. Insert your knife underneath of the skin only, with the blade up rather than the blade down, so that you're cutting into the meat. Also, cutting into bone with a sharp knife will dull the knife more quickly. And so cutting around the legs, getting an incision all the way around the skin, just above the hoof, and then go down the inside of the leg of the animal toward the breastbone. Or if you're on the rear legs, up toward the where you would think of the belly button to be. Make an incision from the neck all the way down to the tail, along the center of the belly. Again, keeping your blade up and your tip controlled so that you don't puncture the intestines and get your knife into that before you're ready. Then pulling the skin away from the flesh with just a little bit of pressure at an angle so as to go between the flesh and the skin. Just begin to work your knife along, loosening the skin so that it pulls and separates away from the flesh. You're not trying to take all of the white stuff. You just want to go through that area with the sharp part of your knife and keep a little bit of tension pulling away from the body of the animal with the skin that's already loose. That tightness will create a good cutting surface for the blade of your knife. Work both directions around each leg. If you can get a helper to pull the leg away from the body, it helps it stay still so that you can put pressure on the skin and the leg isn't just constantly moving around with the pressure you're putting on. Good sharp knife is going to make your life a lot easier. If you're not familiar with sharpening a knife with a sharpening stone system, not a quick sharpener like a field sharpener from an outdoor store, not one of those, but an actual butchering system of sharpening a knife. I want to watch some of the videos on that. Makes a huge difference in your hand strength, your muscles, the results that you get in the butchering process. Don't be scared of working on a first time skinning or slaughter. You'll find the more meat you can leave on the animal, the better. However, butchering it for our own family's consumption, if we miss a little bit as we are in the slaughtering, skinning process, we learn how to do it better the next time. And if you happen to cut through the skin because you're being really careful to get all the skin off, then that's okay. You can actually use that as a handhold to put your fingers in and get better pressure on the skin, pulling it away from the animal. This particular pig had a rupture when we got it, so there's some abnormal development of fat on the belly area, but the rupture did heal as the animal grew on our homestead. When you've got it skinned down close to the ground, go ahead and make an incision blade down on the breastbone of the animal, being careful to only push until you feel the breastbone under your knife blade, and then back off the pressure so you don't dull your knife. Then when you are up near the neck, you can turn it blade up again. Then at the bottom of that breastbone, you want to back off the pressure quite a bit because you don't want to stick your knife down into the guts. At that point, you can begin to either make very light cuts, blade down, or as you can see here, turn it blade up so that you can control just the tip and you don't have to worry about cutting into organs and things that you don't want to. Get the meat sliced all the way down to the breastbone. You're going to want to cut through that with a blade of some type. Get that cut all the way down into the throat. Then using a sawzall, again, blade up, start at the intestinal end of the breastbone, holding your saw at an angle to get the blade to come up into the breastbone and cut down into the organs as little as possible. Work your way up the incision you've already made with your knife and open up that chest cavity. You want to go ahead and slice through that so that you know that everything is loose up near the head end. As you can see here, the chest area had filled with blood and is now going to drain out. Working your way down in the chest area, you want to get the sacs that hold the heart and the lungs and the organs up near the head end of the animal. Get those sacs cut through and released from the chest cavity, the rib cage, so that they're ready to fall out, come out later. Don't cut all the way through the stomach area, the abdomen. You don't want to take that all the way through yet, because then when you raise the animal up, the guts will be falling out in an uncontrolled way. You want to get the animal up so that you can get a cart underneath of it. Once you have the chest cavity cleaned and ready to go, you can finish skinning up near the head if you're going to save any of the head meat. Using a gambrel and a chain hoist, we attach a lifting chain to an overhead board substantial enough to hold the weight of the animal, as well as us pulling down and putting pressure on it. You can use a gambrel in a lot of different designs and setups. Ours has chains on either end, so we can run a chain, make an incision just below the hoof between the major tendon and the bone. You can slide a chain through there, and then we have hooks welded onto our gambrel so we can attach that chain that pulls the legs apart and holds them separated. Then have somebody raise that gambrel up so it's at a good, comfortable height for you, and you can begin skinning the remainder of the animal that was on the ground. You can find places to cut through the tail with a knife, or you can just get it skinned down to the tail and then make a very brief incision with the sawzall blade, cut through the bones of the tail so that that part of the skin will continue to come loose. You can try to take some of the back fat with the skin, or you can again separate between the skin and the fat, leaving the fat on the animal if you want to save some of that fat to make lard for saving and using in the kitchen. Continue raising the animal a little at a time and skinning your way down the back. Once you've got it where you're ready to raise it up in the air, you can raise it up a little higher and prepare a cart to go underneath of it. Have this cart ready and in place. So depending on how open you made the incision for releasing the internal organs of the animal, if they're wanting to come out earlier than you're ready, then the cart being on hand is optimal. Go ahead and get the animal raised up, and you can finish taking the skin off. Once the skin comes off, then you have a lot less to deal with and work with. It's easier to get to what you need to release the internal organs of the animal and let them fall into the cart that you already placed underneath of the animal. The skin also is easy to release when you finish getting it all the way down. That skin can just fall into your cart as well. Make an incision starting from the tail end of the animal, getting through the stomach muscle right down the center without digging down in and puncturing the internal organs. Go ahead and make that incision to connect the opening at the tail end of the animal. Most difficult parts to know where to cut and how to cut is cutting around the end of the intestines, where the intestines go through to the tail of the animal, and cutting up through the bones at the hip and getting that intestinal attachment released from the meat so that that will pull through. You're not cutting the intestines and getting any of the bacteria or the waste onto the meat or onto your knife. So cutting around the intestinal tract all the way out to the exit of the animal. Once you've got it cleaned, you can use a sawzall to cut through the bone that attaches the bottom side of the two legs, which is now the part that you're facing. Once you cut that bone, things separate and you can cut down and get around that intestinal wall without cutting into the intestinal wall. just releases that tissue from the tail of the animal. Never getting any of the internal digested food or bacteria onto the knife or onto the meat. There is a zip tool that's made for deer gutting. It's a fantastic tool. It's got a razor blade knife attached with a plastic curve around the razor blade, so you can get that plastic up and you just slide it up. The plastic protects your razor blade from making contact with any of the internal organs, and that razor blade does the work of cutting through the remainder of the stomach flesh. Then just start at the tail of the animal, putting gentle down pressure on the intestines. A lot of the weight of the intestines and the organs pulls down for you, but just putting a little bit of down pressure on that while you do a little bit of knife work to separate the attaching muscles and fibers and things. Then just working your way down toward the head, making sure and cutting loose any connective tissue as you go. There are sacs inside of the chest cavity that are attached to the chest cavity, a fairly substantial thin layer of muscle that encases the lungs and the heart. You want to cut through that thin curtain of muscle, allowing that and all of the internal organs that are attached to it to fall out of the opening into the cart you've placed underneath of the animal. If you haven't already, finish detaching the skin from the head of the animal, and you can throw that over into your cart, or if you can raise the animal up high enough to get it above the cart and finish working on it, then you can detach it with the cart still underneath. And using your knife and make an incision just below the skinned part of the hooves, the legs, cutting through as much of the flesh as you can with your knife, and then using a sawzall blade, cut through the bone portion of those legs. Go ahead and take all four, or both bottom hooves off. Then again, making an incision through the neck to get as much of the head as you can detached with your knife, trying not to cut into the bone. Then once you get through as much of the flesh as you can with your knife, using your sawzall blade, cut through the bone connecting the head to the body. Once you get through that bone, finish separating the head so that it comes loose and you can get that out of the way. Once you have the head detached, starting at the tail, looking at the back of the animal, the top back of the animal, you want to start at the tail and make an incision straight down the center of the backbone of the animal, cutting through as much of the flesh as you can, just feeling the tip of the blade of your knife making contact with the backbone, working your way down through the animal, getting that prepped to cut in half. Then with the sawzall, you can go down that same cut line. Sawzall does not do well cutting through loose flesh, and your blade on your knife obviously doesn't do well cutting through bone. So using the blade to get through as much of the bone as you can, and then a sawzall blade to cut through the backbone or whatever bone needs to be separated, so that the two halves of your pig now can be either cut into quarters for transportation and hanging, or the halves can be carried in as they are for hanging. There's lots of information out there about the safety procedures for how long a pig needs to hang before you butcher it. Make sure and follow those guidelines and procedures so that your family, your butchering, your slaughtering is done safely. A good garden hose rinse gets little bits of bone fragment from the sawzall off, finishes rinsing blood off, finishes getting any loose pieces from where you were in the cutting process, rinses the animal off, gets it nice and clean, nice fresh water to rinse it all off from tail down. And the last thing you'll do is take the halves off, and part of that process, either before you take them down or after you take them down, will be to make sure and cut the rear leg hooves off. You can do this before, or you can do this at the end. Usually it's just up overhead, and so I save mine until it's time to start lowering the animal down before I start worrying about trying to get the rear leg hooves cut off. If you're going to hang it in quarters, there's several different versions of what rib you separate the front half of the animal between and from the back half of the animal. But if you decide to separate it, just pick which one you think will work best. You can go in between the rib, cut toward the backbone and toward the breastbone. Get, again, as much of the flesh cut through as you can with your knife, and then what you have to with the sawzall you can cut through and detach the front half of the or the front quarter of the animal from the rear quarter of the animal.